everybody, it's Courtney. I'm here with another design team project for Scrapping for Less. Today I'm going to be using the Newton's Nook stamp set from the latest Flavor of the Month card kit. And I have two pieces of Nina Solar White here. I cut one down with a stitched rectangle die and the other is cut down to 4¼ by 5½. And I'm going to be creating kind of my own pattern paper here on the larger panel. I'm just kind of placing my smaller panel on top to kind of get the sizing or the placement right of my little sprinkles here. So I'm using blackout ink by Ink on 3, but you can use any ink for this particular part of the card. I just happen to have this on my desk. And I'm taking the little stamp from the stamp set, and these are just sprinkles basically, and I'm going all around the edges of this card panel. Now I know I'm going to end up cutting this down a little bit so that I have a border around my card base itself. So I'm not necessarily going all the way to the edge. You can start off with a smaller piece, but I just figured that this was a little bit easier for me. So once my stamping was done on that particular panel, I went ahead and put that aside, and I'm going to keep that same ink out because it's Copic safe. And I'm going to stamp the large image from the stamp set, Newton and his little donut here, right onto the panel that I cut down with that stitched rectangle die. And we're going to go ahead and Copic color this. And I kept the coloring pretty simple on this. I am going to make this little cat a gray cat, and I'm going in right with my darkest color first, just because I find that the cool grays as well as the warm gray markers do blend easily, so I don't necessarily need to put my lightest color down first. And I'm just adding my very darkest areas, so basically where my shadows will be. Off to the right side of his little face, that's kind of underneath part of the donut, so that would be a shadow there. Where his body is underneath the donut and where his little back legs are laying over the rest of his body. Next, moving on to the C5, and I'm extending all of those areas out that we created with the C7, but I'm also adding some shading on either side of his little face and on the bottom part of his back legs there. And this would pretty much be one of my mid-tone colors. So I'm adding more shadows with this, not necessarily in places that I put the C7. Next, going on to the C3, and I'm extending all of those areas out a little bit further. Also going over those shadows that his little front paws would be creating on his little face there. Going directly over his little nose there, because I'm going to go in with a R20, I think I ended up using. Next, I added the shadow for his little belly just because I wanted his belly to be a little bit lighter than the rest of his body. So I am just adding the C3 and the C1, filling in the remaining areas with that C1, including his belly, and I'm kind of fading that off to a lighter color towards the bottom where there would not be a shadow. Going in with that R20 just to add a little bit of pink to the insides of his ears, his little nose, and little pads on his back feet. Next, for the donut, I'm going to start off, I'm using all E50 for the entire donut. So I'm going to start with the donut part itself, and this is going to be lighter than the frosting. So I'm going to cover up the entire area with my lightest color, then add my shadowing with the E55, pretty much going along the line where the frosting is. That would cast a shadow on the donut itself. Once that E55 was down, I extended those areas out with the E53, just leaving a very, very small highlight on just some of the areas on the outside edge of the donut and going back over that with the E50. Not really worried about being too careful here. If I go over the frosting area, it's fine because I'm going to be using the E50 markers for that as well. So for my lightest color is the E53 for the frosting. So I'm going to, initially, I was going to add some highlights on the top part where it's kind of drooped over, I guess, the donut. But I ended up fixing that later because I hated it. The sprinkles underneath it would kind of defeat the whole purpose of doing that. I'm adding my darkest areas along the edge of the frosting itself, being the donut would be raised up a little bit. The lightest part would be right there in the center. So I'm adding my E59 right along that line, just basically going directly over it. And you can see where I was going to initially put those highlights. So ignore that. I'm going to go back in and fix that. Next, I'm extending those areas out with the E57. Then I'll move on to the E55, and then finally the E53. And it just wasn't dark enough for me. It wasn't looking like chocolate. So typically for my darkest colors, that's the color I use the least amount of. But in this case, I wanted my frosting to be a little bit darker. I wanted it to look more like frosting. And you can see I forgot the shadow where his little paws are kind of hanging over. So I did go back and add the E59 for that area as well. Blended that out and I still wasn't liking it. So once I had everything filled in, I went back in with the E57 and just extended the E57 out a little bit further and filled in those little areas where I had initially preserved for a highlight. Once I had the E57 back down a little bit further, I went back in with the E55 and then finally back to the E53, and I liked this look a lot better. It looked more like chocolate. So for the sprinkles itself, I am not going to be using my Copics here. First, I'm going to fix some areas that I was messy with my colorless blender. And I'm going to be using some gel pens. And now these are the Jelly Roll Souffle pens. So these are opaque, but they also give a little bit of texture. So they'll give, wherever you color them, it's going to be raised up just a little bit. You don't necessarily need to use these particular gel pens. You can use any gel pen for this. The more opaque, the better, because we're coloring over a pretty dark color, especially for the frosting. So I'm just taking a variety of colors here and kind of just filling in my little sprinkles randomly. I don't really have any rhyme or reason to this. I chose some pretty bright colors. Most of the souffle pens are fairly bright anyway, but I wanted to make sure that I did use some bright colors because some of those areas on the chocolate frosting are very dark. So you'll want to make sure that you'll have something that actually shows up on top of the E59 and E57 especially. So once I had all of my sprinkles done on my little donut here, I'm going to move on to the card panel that we stamped our sprinkles on. And I'm going to do the same exact thing. Now I'm not going to show you all of this because this took a little bit of time. Even though I'm not doing any shading, I'm just kind of randomly filling in some of these sprinkles. It still did take a little bit of time. Keep in mind that gel pens do not dry instantly like a Copic marker or, if you're using a colored pencil, which you can definitely use. I just wanted something a little bit more bright. So make sure that you're not touching the areas that you just colored, especially the souffle pens. They tend to take a little bit extra time to dry. So I'm just carefully rotating my paper each time to make sure that I don't accidentally smear the gel pen. And you can see that I went in with all of the colors and I did put this aside to dry for a minute or two before I moved on to the next step. But you'll see that this orange is the last color I'm adding here and I did end up smearing it a little bit, but I was able to cover most of it up with just a plain white gel pen and most of it was covered up with the main panel anyway. So once all of my sprinkles were colored, I went ahead and stamped my sentiment, and this is also from that same stamp set. I wanted to layer this onto the pink cardstock that comes in the kit, which is also one of the colors that I used for the sprinkles. So I just picked an ink that I had from my stash that closely matched it, and I'll just go ahead and stamp that directly under my little cat there. And then I ended up trimming down this panel of sprinkles, like I said before, to make sure that I had a little bit of a border showing from that card base to have that pink show a little bit to match that sentiment. You can see there's where I smeared my little sprinkles there, the orange sprinkles. So I took my bone folder, creased over my card base there, and kind of just started layering to make sure that I had enough of a border. I didn't, so I ended up having to trim that down just a little bit more. I adhered my sprinkle panel down to my card base with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue flat. You can see I have gel pen all over my fingers. And then I just measured my little panel there in the middle and cut a piece of fun foam to pop that up onto the center of my card. I use the fun foam that has adhesive on one side, so I usually put the adhesive right onto the card panel, and then I'll take my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere that panel or that fun foam directly to my card base itself. That way it gives me a minute or two to kind of reposition it if I need to, which I usually need to, because I can never get a card panel on straight the first time. So that is the card for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Bye.